At 1640 on March 23, 1942, in the dim, wind-stung evening of Portsmouth Navy Yard, the USS Atik, AK-101, slid away from the pier with a slowness that felt almost human, as if the old merchant hull itself hesitated to enter the cold Atlantic again. The air smelled of salt, diesel, wet rope, and the metallic taste of an early spring storm moving in from the east. On deck, beneath false timber screens hiding the 4-inch guns, Commander Harry Lynnstone Higgs, 43 years old, Virginia-born, stood motionless, his gloved hands clasped behind his back, listening to the long, mournful blast of the ship's whistle. There was no cheering crowd, no ceremonial send-off, only a few silent dock workers watching the freighter-shaped vessel drift toward the channel, each of them unaware that the ship they saw was no freighter at all. Higgs knew how fragile the illusion really was. The Atik was a Q-ship, an outdated concept resurrected in desperation, her guns hidden behind collapsible panels, her hull aged, her silhouette indistinguishable from 1,000 harmless American cargo ships. But beneath the disguise lay a crew trained to spring the trap in seconds, and a commander who understood that this mission was a gamble against mathematics. The U-boats owned these waters. In the first 3 months of 1942, the Germans had sunk more tonnage off the U.S. coast than Britain had lost in the entire First World War. And now he was taking an obsolete decoy into the same hunting grounds, hoping one submarine would be bold or careless enough to approach. The sea beyond the breakwater turned darker, the horizon dissolving into an unbroken band of steel-blue water. The crew moved quietly, avoiding speech as if sound itself could jinx the fragile balance. Higgs sensed their unease. Most were young reservists called up in a frenzy after Pearl Harbor, men trained quickly, armed with fragments of doctrine, and now serving on a ship that carried no armor, no speed, and no real chance if the deception failed. Each face he passed in the narrow companionways carried the same expression, a forced steadiness masking the knowledge that they were sailing into waters where ships vanished without sending a final message. As Portsmouth disappeared behind them, replaced by the heavy Atlantic swell, the wind shifted and the temperature dropped. Somewhere beyond the curved horizon, Reinhard Hardegen's U-123 prowled through the darkness, its commander hunting with the confidence of a man who had already shattered the American coastline once. Higgs could not know it yet, but the paths of hunter and decoy were already bending toward each other, drawn by the logic of a war spinning faster than either side could control. By the time the night settled fully over the Atik, the last lights of the coast faded into blackness, and with them faded the last chance for anyone aboard to turn back. The sea thickened around the ship, pushing her deeper into the Atlantic, towards an encounter that no one on board would survive. And somewhere below decks, the first creaks of the old hull warned that the ocean itself had begun to close in.
In the early months of 1942, the Atlantic Ocean had turned into a graveyard, stretching from Maine to Florida. And the officers inside the Navy Department in Washington carried the weight of that catastrophe in their voices, their movements, even in the way they handled papers now smudged from sleepless hands. Commander Harry Lynnstone Higgs, though far from the capital, felt that same tension carried through every dispatch he had read before departure, reports written with the clipped urgency of men watching a coastline bleed. German submarines, operating almost unchallenged under the pale glow of American coastal lights, were sinking tankers, freighters, and troop transports at a rate that seemed surreal even to those who had studied the worst scenarios before the war. Operation Paukenschlag, the German drumbeat, was living up to its name. The United States had entered the war, but it had not yet caught up with it. Convoy systems were not fully established. Air patrols were sporadic. Radar and sonar sets were scarce, spread thin across too many ships. The admirals faced pressure from the President, from Congress, from the public, and from the British, all demanding action while American coastal waters burned nightly with the flames of shattered tankers. Higgs had read the intelligence summaries, showing the frantic tone beneath the formal language. We must do something, anything, immediately. From this panic, the Q-ship program was reborn. It was not a strategic solution. It was a political one, a psychological one, a gesture meant to show that the Navy was acting. Q-ships had been used with some success in the First World War, but nearly every naval commander now understood that the game had changed. Submarines in 1942 were faster, better armed, and led by a generation of commanders who had honed their skills hunting across the Atlantic for years. Yet the idea persisted. An armed decoy disguised as a merchant ship might force a U-boat to surface. A sudden opening of gun panels might deliver a fatal blow. One successful engagement might lift morale. And so ships like the USS Atik, old, vulnerable, mechanically tired, were pulled from reserve lists and hastily converted. Civilian-looking timbers were bolted over gun positions. Crews were drilled in deception, taught to play the role of helpless merchant sailors until the moment the guns were revealed. Commander Higgs had watched the installation of these false structures with a strange unease. The panels looked convincing from distance, but up close they felt flimsy, more theatrical set than military equipment. He wondered then, as he wondered now on the open Atlantic, whether the disguise would fool a German commander experienced enough to recognize an improvised trick. Meanwhile at sea, the Germans continued their assault. Reinhard Hardegen, the U-boat commander whose name had already circulated through Allied intelligence, had become a symbol of Germany's dominance off the American coast. He maneuvered U-123 with the confidence of a man who knew the ocean favored him. For every measure the United States attempted, the U-boat seemed 2 steps ahead, slipping through patrol lines and striking at night with torpedoes that left no survivors. The coastal blackout came too late. Air patrols were too few. Merchant ships still sailed independently because convoys required escorts the Navy did not yet possess. Higgs felt these failures in his bones. When he had been handed command of the Atik, the Admiral's final words were almost an admission. "We need time. Buy it however you can." The Q-ships were not expected to survive long. They were meant to distract, to complicate U-boat decisions, to force submarine captains to be cautious. But deep down, Higgs understood that they were also sacrifices. Stopgaps thrown into the sea while America scrambled to build the fleet it should have had months earlier. And now, with the horizon stretching in every direction, the Atik steaming farther from help, Higgs felt the weight of that impossible assignment bearing down on him. The Atlantic wind howled through the false bulwarks. The old deck seams groaned. Somewhere below, fuel sloshed with a hollow echo. Every mile carried them deeper into waters where dozens of American ships had already vanished. Yet the greatest danger was still ahead. For even as the United States invented desperate tactics to slow the slaughter, Reinhard Hardegen and U-123 were preparing to return to the hunt, and the path of hunter and decoy was narrowing with each passing hour.
The wind shifted on the evening of March 24th, carrying with it a deeper chill from the north and a tremor in the sea that Commander Harry Lynnstone Higgs felt long before the barometer confirmed the change. He stood on the starboard bridge wing, collar turned up against the cold, watching the slow, deliberate roll of the USS Atik as she pushed deeper into waters where the charts were already stained with the names of lost ships. The crew moved below him with quiet purpose, young men who trusted their commander because they had no one else to trust, and Higgs bore that responsibility like additional weight in his coat pockets. His face, weathered from years in the Navy, carried a calm the crew mistook for certainty, though in truth it came from something far more personal, a sense of duty carved into him long before America entered the war. Higgs had been raised on the tidewaters of Virginia, the son of a fisherman who believed the sea revealed a man's character quicker than any battlefield. He had served on destroyers in the First World War, hunted submarines when sonar was still an unreliable novelty, and later commanded cargo vessels through Pacific storms where the ocean itself seemed intent on testing him. He was not reckless nor particularly ambitious. He carried a quiet steadiness, a conviction that orders once accepted must be carried out, no matter their odds. This sense of duty was why he accepted command of the Atik without hesitation, even though he understood the truth that others avoided saying out loud. A Q-ship was a coffin disguised as a merchantman. Far to the east, beneath the surface of the same darkening sea, another commander moved through his vessel with a contrasting confidence. Reinhard Hardegen, leader of U-123, was 33 years old, a decade younger than Higgs, yet already a seasoned hunter whose name stirred anxiety in every Allied intelligence report. Born in Bremen, raised near the docks where warships loomed like monuments, Hardegen had entered the war with exceptional instincts. His early career as a naval aviator ended after an injury, but his transfer to the submarine service had been, in his own words, a second birth. He possessed a cold, analytical mind, an ability to read the ocean's surface the way others read letters on paper, and a natural leadership that drew his men into unwavering loyalty. In the control room of U-123, the air was thick with the metallic scent of machinery and the faintness of diesel lingering in ventilation ducts. Hardegen stood beneath the red lamps, one hand resting lightly on the chart table as he listened to his hydrophone operator interpreting the distant thrum of Atlantic shipping. To his crew, he was always composed, his voice firm even during violent depth charge attacks. They respected his discipline, his refusal to waste torpedoes, his uncanny ability to predict convoy routes. Yet beneath that precision lay a streak of daring that had made him famous during Operation Drumbeat, where he sank Allied ships almost in sight of American beaches. The ocean was shaping a collision course between these two men. Higgs, with his measured resolve, a veteran taking an antiquated ship into lethal waters, and Hardegen, the younger predator, whose patrols had altered the entire balance of the Atlantic in months. On maps, their paths were just thin pencil strokes, but at sea they were powerful currents drawing them closer. Higgs sensed the invisible tension as the ship creaked its way south of Cape Hatteras. The crew joked softly in the mess, yet their eyes betrayed the worry of men who knew the statistics. Submarines were everywhere, and merchant ships, even armed ones, rarely survived encounters. Yet none aboard the Atik knew that Hardegen had already turned U-123 westward, hunting for silhouettes against the faint glow of distant shore lights. As the night deepened, Higgs stepped into the chart room and studied the predicted track of U-boat activity, his fingers tracing the arcs of danger zones like a man reading a prophecy. The sea was calm, deceptively so, and he sensed that the stillness was not peace, but a pause, an inhalation before violence. What neither commander knew was that within 48 hours, their fates would intertwine in a brief, furious duel that would turn the Atlantic black with fire. Night had fallen unevenly on March 26th, the kind of night where the horizon dissolved into a single sheet of cold darkness broken only by the faint tremor of starlight on the waves. The USS Atik moved steadily, her engines thudding with the weary rhythm of a merchant ship that had seen too many storms and too few repairs. Commander Harry Lynnstone Higgs stood beside the helmsman, watching the ink-black water rise and fall against the bow. The wind carried a sharpness that made the men on watch tighten their collars, but beneath the physical discomfort lay something heavier, a sense that the ocean had grown too quiet. Shortly after 1930, the lookout on the port wings stiffened, leaning forward into the darkness. "Light on the water, bearing green, low," he whispered, though the sea swallowed most of his voice. Higgs stepped toward him, binoculars raised. At first he saw nothing. Then, faint as a breath, the moonlit ridgeline of a wake. A signature no merchant ship ever left cut across the swell. A submarine, surfaced and moving slow, stalking. Unbeknownst to Atik, Reinhard Hardegen had been watching her for more than an hour. From the U-123's conning tower, he saw a lone freighter silhouette, lights doused, speed modest, behavior typical for a cautious but unescorted American cargo ship. He did not yet sense the deception, for the Atik played her role convincingly, the false deck cargo, the deliberate sluggishness,
the slight weaving motion intended to mimic an inexperienced merchant crew. To Hardegen, this was prey, a gift in the vast empty sea. At 1900, he gave the command, "Torpedo, bow toot 1, fire." The torpedo struck Atik on her starboard quarter with a shuddering roar that ripped through the hull plates and sent men sprawling across the deck. Heat, smoke, and splinters blasted through the engine room, and for a breathless moment the ship seemed to lurch sideways, groaning like a wounded animal. Higgs gripped a rail as the deck tilted under his boots, tasted burnt oil in the air, and forced himself to breathe. He had expected this moment, trained the crew for it, rehearsed the deception until it felt natural, but no rehearsal prepared a man for the violence of real impact. "Damage control teams, stations," he shouted. "Begin the feigned evacuation." The crew scrambled into action with a mixture of discipline and raw fear. Men ran to the lifeboats, shouting in panicked tones that were only half-acted. Others dragged hoses or tossed crates overboard to mimic chaos. The Atik listed visibly now, smoke rising from the torn stern. To a distant observer, she looked like a merchant ship dying. Hardegen watched through his periscope. The scene fit perfectly with every U-boat manual. A lone freighter struck aft, men abandoning ship under fire, a vessel settling but not sinking. Hardegen surfaced U-123 to finish the kill with deck gun and small arms, conserving torpedoes. The critical moment had come. As U-123 approached within 800 yards, the Atik's crew braced behind their disguised positions. Higgs waited for the submarine to offer its vulnerable silhouette broadside. The false bulwark panels were rigged to drop in seconds. The guns were manned, fingers were tight on triggers. The men's breaths were shallow, their faces streaked with smoke and terror. The entire success of the mission, indeed the only hope for survival, rested on the Germans believing the ruse just a few moments longer. Then, at Higgs' signal, the deception cracked open. The panels crashed onto the deck with wooden screams. The hidden guns swung into view. And in that frozen instant, the German sailors on the submarine's bridge stood exposed like figures caught in a lantern beam. "Fire!" Atik's forward 4-inch gun thundered, followed by the staccato eruption of machine guns spitting tracers across the dark water. The first shell slammed into U-123's conning tower, showering sparks across the deck. German crewmen ducked, one man thrown backward by shrapnel. Hardegen felt the heat of the blast, shouted for evasive maneuvers, and lunged for the hatch. For a moment, a brief, electrifying heartbeat, it seemed the Atik had seized the impossible advantage, had turned the tables on a hunter unprepared for a wounded foe that suddenly bit back. But the ocean, indifferent and vast, had other plans. U-123's engine surged. The submarine began to dive, slipping beneath the firestorm with a speed that defied hope. And as the sea swallowed the gray hull, Higgs realized the trap had sprung, but not tightly enough. Their moment had passed, and now the ocean held its breath, waiting for the Germans to return the blow.
For a few trembling seconds after U-123 slipped beneath the black surface, the gunners aboard the USS Atik held their breath, their weapons still hot, their ears ringing from the blast of their own guns. Smoke drifted across the deck like a low, wandering fog. Commander Harry Lynnstone Higgs stared into the darkness where the submarine had disappeared, listening for the telltale churn of a diesel engine or the metallic echo of a diving plane. Nothing. Only the wind, the crackle of small fires on the stern, and the low groan of a wounded ship fighting to stay afloat. He knew what came next. A U-boat caught by surprise did not retreat, it regrouped. Hardegen was too skilled, too experienced, too calm under pressure to abandon a target that had dared to wound him. He would come back. He would circle below the thermocline, align his tubes, and fire again with the cold precision that had defined his career. Higgs felt the inevitability of it in his chest, something heavy, almost suffocating. Below the surface, Reinhard Hardegen wiped the blood from his cheek where shrapnel had grazed him. His crew worked with fast, silent discipline. The periscope had been lowered. The control room was dim under red lighting. Only the tight clicks of valves and the whispered commands of the helmsman broke the tension. Hardigan's face was expressionless, his mind already calculating angles, speeds, and currents. The Atik had revealed herself, a wolf dressed as a sheep, a ship built to deceive. Hardegen respected the boldness, even admired it, but respect did not soften his resolve. "Prepare tube 2, he said calmly. "Depth 6 meters. Target stationary or near stationary." The earlier damage had slowed the Atik. She was listing, her wake uneven. She would not outrun anything now. Back on the surface, Higgs moved among his men, steadying voices, giving short commands. They were fighting fires, dragging wounded sailors away from the stern, securing ammunition boxes that had burst open during the torpedo hit. The deck glistened with oil. The air tasted of gunpowder and burning insulation. The lights flickered as the ship's generators struggled. Some of the younger sailors had eyes wide with fear, glancing toward the water as if expecting the submarine to rise like a shark. "Steady," Higgs murmured. "We fight until the last moment. The ship won't die quietly." But the ocean was already shifting. On the starboard side, the water rippled unnaturally, a thin silver trail moving beneath the surface. "Torpedo wake!" someone screamed. The shout was swallowed by the blast. The second torpedo slammed into Atik's port side with catastrophic force. The hull plates buckled inward, the deck lifted under Higgs's feet. A furnace-like roar tore through the midsection. Men were thrown into the air, into walls, into the sea. For a moment, even the wind seemed silenced by the detonation. The ship began to list sharply, her bow rising slightly as seawater poured through ruptured bulkheads. In the engine room, where several sailors had remained to keep the generators alive, the explosion collapsed the forward bulkhead. Steam and flame erupted through the compartment. No one inside survived long enough to scream. Higgs clawed his way upright, the world swaying violently around him. "Abandon ship!" he shouted, though he knew the chances had gone. The lifeboats had been wrecked by the first blast. The second had obliterated the rest. Men stumbled toward railings, only to find nothing but oil-slick water roiling below. Then came the sound, the deep, booming crack from within the ship's belly. The fire had reached the ammunition stores. There was no more time. The Atik exploded in a white-orange flash that illuminated the sea for miles. Flames shot upward like a volcanic plume, debris scattering through the night sky. The old hull split open, the stern ripping apart as the force hurled steel fragments into the air. The shockwave rolled across the water, striking U-123's hull even from below the surface. When the light faded, the Atik was almost gone. Only burning wreckage floated where the ship had been moments earlier. Men struggled in the water for seconds, maybe minutes, before the cold Atlantic swallowed them. The sea showed no mercy. The night wind carried no sound of survivors. Hardegen listened in silence as the hydrophone officer reported the settling echo of a ship breaking apart. No cheers, no celebration, only professional acknowledgement. "Surface," Hardegen ordered. "Search for signs." But there were none. Only burning flotsam drifting in the moonlit swell. 141 American sailors had vanished into the darkness, and the Atlantic closed over them as if they had never existed.
When dawn finally crept over the Atlantic on March 27, 1942, the sea bore no trace of the violence it had devoured hours earlier. The water lay cold, swollen, and indifferent, as if the night's firestorm had been nothing more than a vanished dream. No lifeboats drifted on the waves, no hands reached out from the swells, no cries carried across the wind. The USS Atik was gone, her crew of 141 men erased without a single survivor to recount their final moments. The only witnesses were the ocean itself and the silent steel hull of U-123, already miles away, running submerged toward its next patrol sector. Commander Harry Lynnstone Higgs, whose steady voice had guided his men through the chaos, had joined them in the deep with the same dignity he had carried through life. There was no grave, no remains to honor, only his name to be etched later onto a marble slab in a quiet memorial hall, where visitors would pause briefly before moving on, unaware that his mission had been built from desperation before it became tragedy. The search began 2 days later. Destroyers, patrol bombers, and cutters combed the region identified in the bloated logs of report stations. They found debris, splintered wood, charred cloth, a few oil-coated fragments of the false bulwarks, but no bodies, no life rafts, no signals. The ocean had closed too quickly, too completely. The rescue personnel sent clipped reports back to Washington, the kind that left no room for emotion. No survivors, wreckage minimal, presumed total loss. But the officers reading them felt the bitter taste behind the words, a heaviness that settled like dust on the desks of men already overwhelmed by bad news. Inside the Navy Department, the reaction was immediate, sharp, and mostly unspoken. The Q-ship program, revived in haste and hope, collapsed under the weight of Atik's destruction. Admirals looked at each other across conference tables with the same grim realization. The era of decoy ships was finished. Against modern submarines armed with torpedoes, trained in night surface attacks, and commanded by men like Reinhard Hardegen, the idea of hiding guns behind plywood was not merely outdated, it was suicidal. By early April, the program was formally canceled. The remaining Q ships were reassigned, their disguised fittings removed as if the Navy wished to erase the entire episode from memory. No press releases announced this decision. No war correspondents were invited to write its obituary. The country, already shaken by losses along the East Coast, would gain nothing from learning that a secret countermeasure had not only failed, but cost an entire crew their lives in a single brief encounter. And yet, as the months unfolded, the Atlantic War began to shift, not because of deception, but because of industry, science, and a more disciplined approach to convoy protection. Aircraft ranging farther offshore, radar sets mounted on patrol planes, escort carriers newly joining the fight, sonar refined to read U-boat echoes more clearly, merchant convoys shielded by destroyers built in American yards at astonishing speed. All of this stemmed the bloodletting that had defined the first half of 1942. The tide turned not through clever traps, but through overwhelming resources and cold, structured logic. Meanwhile, Reinhard Hardegen, whose torpedoes had torn the Atik apart, continued his patrol, sinking more ships before returning to France. After the war, he became a businessman and later a politician in Bremen, one of the few U-boat commanders to live into old age. In interviews decades later, he spoke of respect for his opponents, but never in detail about the Atik. Perhaps he understood, even then, that the encounter had been less a victory and more a footnote in the machinery of war, a tragic meeting of two commanders carrying out orders shaped by forces far beyond their control. For the families of the Atik's crew, the war left only letters. Letters of condolence, letters of explanation, letters that tried to soften the truth but could not hide it. Their sons, husbands, and fathers had sailed on a mission whose purpose was secret and whose end was swift. Some families clung to hope for months, believing the men might have drifted on a lifeboat unseen. Others understood immediately, guided by a quiet intuition, that the sea does not return those it truly claims. Today,
The name USS Atik exists mostly in naval records and on the walls of memorial chapels where the fallen of the Atlantic campaign are honored. Few people stop to read the story behind it. Few know that the ship sailed as a weapon built from fear, that it died in minutes, that it left behind no survivors to argue that its sacrifice had meaning. And yet the lesson remains, carved not in stone, but in the invisible doctrine of navies worldwide. War punishes improvisation when it replaces preparation. The Atik sailed because the United States was unready, because panic demanded action, because men like Higgs were asked to buy time with their lives. The ocean accepted that payment in full, and the silence that followed became the only memorial the Atlantic ever offers.